being live on YouTube, and members of the public and the media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and to continue discussions taking place. So I'd like to welcome everybody here and all those watching on YouTube. I think it would be appropriate for us, as usual, to start with a 72-second silence to remember those who lost their lives in the dreadful tragedy. Apologies for absence. We've had apologies from Walla Idris and Council Forty-Faxon. Do any members have an interest to declare under A2?
Yes, I think probably in terms of item A4, the environmental health discussion, I must declare that I currently live in a conversion property and have lived in conversion properties for 23 years, including managing one. I do not know whether that property would be affected by the proposals, but that's on the table anyway.
Thank you.
Likewise, I live in a conversion property. I don't know whether or not it would be affected.
Thank you. That is those. The minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of July 2022 have been circulated. Can I sign them as a correct record?
Ask a question. I'm not sure of writing. There was a in the minutes. There was an agreement by the committee that we requested that a single member of the leadership team should represent the leadership team in its response to the call for action last court. Have we received a response?
Yes.
So Joan Kamali is going to lead the response.
Right.
But can I sign these factually correct? Sorry.
You've got to not look at me because I had COVID and I wasn't here. So
Surely you were avidly watching from your sickbed on YouTube.
I decline to comment on that.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to sign them correct in the absence of any other comments. Sign no attention. So now we move on to paper A4, which is proposals for an initial houses in multiple occupation licensing scheme. Consultations, findings, and options for discussion. And I would invite, but they are already here, thank you very much, Councillor Jem Kanali, Tim Davis, and Annette to speak. So how are you planning to
do a brief introduction? I think the report coming into the weighty 125 pages probably contains a lot of the information that we're likely to discuss here this evening. The report is obviously for the group to discuss proposals for an additional HMO licensing register across the borough. This would apply borough-wide, the intent of which would be to raise the quality of housing standards across RBKC. Obviously, something RBKC takes very seriously is making sure that our homes are not only safe, but they are warm and that they are fit for habitation. We do know through this consultation exercise that there is a large number of properties across the borough that fail to meet the standards that we would like to see. Some of the proposals as a way to tackle it are being discussed here this evening. And as you've already alluded to, there's a few options as to how we may be able to progress, subject to this group's approval. You'll see that there is a recommendation to lean towards the option to support Section 254 properties, which sort of what we would consider the quintessential HMO of 3 to 4 people sharing a home, sort of effectively a flat share, student housing, that sort of thing. But there is also the opportunity to discuss Section 257s, which are licensed across London, as well as in a number of boroughs across London. This is obviously something new for the council. It's taken a number of years to sort of get to this point. I know the officers have put a huge amount of effort in to make sure that this committee here this evening have a proper amount of evidence to discuss, as it is clearly something that will impact upon could impact upon up to about 9,000 properties within the borough, which obviously has repercussions for a number of our residents. The officers will be here to sort of answer the slightly more technical points, but I'm happy to take questions on the general policy as it stands or as it's proposed.
Thank you. Do you want to have something to start with, or should we just dive into questions?
To dive into questions.
Perfect. Thank you. I know, as well as in the report you say, there's some extra pictures to members of the committee showing some of the status on property. That was very helpful. Thank you. Okay. Well, Craig, I know you've got.
I've got a list. So
so why don't you start us on?
and my questions are for the lead member, and I have given him notice of broad areas, so he can be prepared for that. And I've got questions on or issues on the papers and specifically on the options as well. So I'll do the whole lot in one go, and then you can reply in whatever way you yourself. You won't be surprised at anything by much. So question one, then I don't think I've seen a government option paper or final version ever that hasn't had a do nothing on it before, and it's certainly accepted practice. And there's no obvious reason in this case why there isn't a do nothing option explored. So why is there no do nothing option at this stage? And I'll just carry on and ask more questions as you come back to me. Next two will be about 257, option 2. And I mean, the first point is this council's meant to have changed fundamentally since the Grenfell tragedy. We've updated the values, specifically to include listening to residents. So in the face of overwhelmingly negative response in the public consultation, particularly in respect of option 2, and specifically in respect of option 2, would you agree that choosing option 2 would fundamentally undermine those new values? And should option 2 therefore not be removed from the paper before it progresses any further, or at least have a strong recommendation as to why it's not, or a strong statement as to why it's not the recommended way forward? And related to that, which is question 3, do you remember, Jen, that one of the straplines of our election manifesto was a quote, fairer borough? And have you noted that option 2 introduces an unfairness on owner-occupiers? And I'll give you one specific example. So an owner-occupier in a conversion flat could well be liable for a share of a licence fee through their service charge, while the owner-occupiers in the next door building, an identical neighbouring building, could escape stealth tax because there are more of them, and therefore they exceed the threshold, the arbitrary threshold of the proportion of owner-occupiers in the paper on 257. So do you agree that that would be unfair and therefore contrary to our election manifesto? And I apologise to Cassie if this is a political point. So question 4. When the proposal went back to the drawing board last year, after the consultation responses came in, I asked in committee whether officers would be interested in getting some residents who understand property management to go into some co-design of a revised scheme, and I did offer to make some introductions. And that was accepted in the committee meeting last year, but it hasn't been taken forward, at least not through me. So I'm wondering why there hasn't been the opportunity for co-design, which is good practice in this council. It's something that's been introduced since Grenfell. And I regard that element as quite disappointing. We haven't had that opportunity. Now moving on to my 5th point, I've got less concern about option 1, where the licence fee would be a business expense. But do you accept that its existence would inevitably be passed on to tenants in the form of higher rent at the time when the rental market's already hugely expensive? And what evidence have you considered to balance that cost against the benefits of introducing option 1? And let's also on option 1, I think supporting evidence does appear to be a lot stronger than for option 2 when you look at the way the problems are set out. But the paper doesn't make any linkage to how the problems are set out will be addressed by the existence of the licence. And it seems to me that there's a whole missing piece in the paper about enforcement. Just the existence of the licence is not going to solve any of these problems, or not that they may be around the edges. So what's going on? What benefits does that licence bring? And how will that be covered? And could you elaborate on that? The next point is actually the final point. So the paper states that Hillingdon had an HMO additional licence scheme that was withdrawn in 2020, and that was news to me from reading this paper. And I do know that Westminster introduced one in 2021, and the section 2257 element was withdrawn 4 months later, which wasn't news to me. But can you tell me why were these two borough schemes withdrawn? And what lessons have you taken from that? What went wrong, or what changed in those boroughs? How's that relevant to us? And I think overall, those are my questions. I mean, this is now a comment, which for the committee. I do think there's potential for option one to be taken forward, but the paper as written isn't fit for purpose and doesn't make the case yet. So that would be my recommendation to the committee, but from having read it and having been involved in looking at it last year. But I think Jennifer will also have the opportunity to come back with me now with his answers.
Well, thank you, Councillor Hammond. That's a good list of questions there. I'll do my best to answer them. I think on the first one, as to a do nothing option, I think you're probably right. That is something that really should have been included. That is always available to the council to make that decision. I suppose really the options presented, not necessarily the paper is somewhat binary in that either you support 254, 257, or simply don't support it at all. So the do nothing option, I suppose, is implicit in that the paper could just be refused as it stands. But that is something I think we should certainly take away before it would progress any further. You mentioned unfairness in section 257. But I think that's a really fair point, if I may. It's why I believe that Westminster themselves struggled to make the case for 257s in their own borough. And there is an inherent unfairness attached to that, because so many of these buildings are run by managing agents rather than by the individual leaseholder or tenant as they may be, and costs can then be just passed through. There is also sort of an unfairness attached to that. You can't really you have no control over what your neighbours may do with their property. They may be an owner-occupier and then leave the country and then rent it out to 4 or more people, and suddenly you're on the hook for paying a portion of their fee, when in fact you had no sort of discretion as to saying no to that process. So I think that's why I personally have sort of supported 254s more than 257s. I also think that 257s, especially in the borough such as ours, where we have so many converted properties, we're not quite, whilst the legislation applies sort of nationwide, KNC is somewhat unique along with other inner London boroughs where we do have a huge number of converted properties, and as you both have made the point, you already live in them. It's not necessarily the case that just because they're converted, they implicitly have to have defects with them. I do think actually that the policy, if it were to be taken forward for 254s, does offer us the enforcement avenues to make sure that all housing is made safe, regardless of whether it's covered by the licence or not. It would give us, would give the council the sort of enforcement tools and strength in order to carry out checks and balances on other properties, because it's not just converted homes, it's also single occupant dwellings, which may have very poor quality of housing as well, which, although it won't be covered by HMO legislation, would still require enforcement. And in order to do that, you need an enforcement team to be able to carry out that work, which is referenced later on in the report that's already being carried out across the council. Your comment on co-design, I think I wasn't present for the initial feedback to this paper, but it is something that the council is very keen to incorporate in all of its policies. So I'm afraid I defer to officers to give a slightly fuller answer as to why you feel it wasn't made apparent in this one, so perhaps leave that to the end. As for the sort of the issues actually being addressed, I suppose that does come back to my point around having the enforcement team to be able to tackle these problems. We are, and the report does highlight a number of issues across the borough, but I'm personally of the view that a lot of these problems will go unseen, and it's very hard to know exactly how bad a problem is until you're able to actually see it with your own eyes. And whilst we can make assumptions as to how many properties would pass or fail the checks, until you actually carry out those checks, it is quite difficult to know whether or not indeed there is as large a problem as is sort of made out across the report. I'm quite hopeful that we won't have as many people in category 1 failing homes as is made out, but if they are, then so much more the case that we do improve the conditions for people's homes, especially as we go into a sort of what would be a somewhat bleak winter, and property sort of insulation and warmth will be a key factor, as well as sort of fire safety and mouldy conditions. Your last point was around alternative, what the other boroughs have done. I'm not fully conscious of what Hillingdon did in 2020, but I do know that Westminster, of course, they sort of introduced this and then rode back very quickly. I think they found, firstly, that it's a very large amount of work initially to have to try and implement, but also that they probably didn't spend as much time debating it and thinking it through in the way that we're doing tonight. I think that your points about 257s are well made. And if we do find through 254s that there is a huge unseen problem in the borough, then probably we would want to discuss whether we think there's more in other segments of the housing market as well. But for now, I imagine that we're already discussing over 3,000 properties being incorporated in a section 254. That's plenty of work for an enforcement team to have to get through. And I want to make sure that we're doing it in an RBKC fashion. I mean, I am aware of Liverpool that implemented a similar policy, and they have 29,000 properties on register and 1 enforcement agent. So very hard to argue that that one person is going to be capable of getting around all 29,000 homes. So are they really adding any value to the landlord or to the tenant? I think RBKC could do this in a much better way, where we're not only offering support to the tenants, but actually helping landlords adapt their homes to make sure that they're safe. We already know there's national legislation coming around not being able to rent your homes out if they don't meet an EPC rating of C. These are things that landlords are going to be conscious of. There will be costs that they'll have to bear to make sure their homes are still lettable. And you made the point around, will this be passed on to the tenants? I think it's very hard to say whether or not it will. I think all landlords pay yearly fees to manage their homes. You do a PAT test on your electrics. You have a gas safety check. You have a number of other fees that your estate agent will charge you. And whilst this is an additional fee, it does actually offer more security to the tenant than perhaps just a gas safety check would, on its own. So not only is it sort of expensible, I think it's something that actually wouldn't have a material impact on the rents being charged. But I am conscious, of course, that any cost could just be passed on to the tenants, of which there would be 3 or 4 at least, splitting the cost. So £50 a year. I think that's all. I'm not sure if you've got follow-up, or if you want to answer.
You certainly may.
All right, thank you, Mary. So on the do nothing option, I think it's very easy to write one because basically there's no benefits from in terms of what we're seeking to achieve. But it does achieve something in the paper in terms of the thoughts about it. On the 257, I'm glad you've accepted my point about unfairness, and I went on about that at some length, and I do think the final version of the paper should be very clear to say that that's not what we want, but pointing as a proper recommendation to option 1 if that's the way you want to go. I think you hinted at enforcement tools and addressing the issue of the enforcement team, but I think we need quite a lot more specifics on that in the paper, because what presumably you're going to pay for to make an extra team through the money raised. So, but that doesn't come across in the paper at all. It's implicit for those who understand papers like this, but it needs to be set out in black and white that that's what's meant. And on Hillingdon, I appreciate you don't know the answer, but could you give us a written answer on that, please?
Yes.
When you found out, helpful. I don't need to know tonight.
Did Tim want to fill any bits in on any of those questions before we move on to other questions?
Well, you wanted to pick up on the co-design,
yeah.
So perhaps between us we'll do a double X on that. I think the headline would be would it be acceptable to co-design what is in effect an enforcement regime? There's backed by legislation and lots of guidance, rules, standards already set up. Maybe the real way to reassure you is that we do this with a soft touch to start with, help support the landlords. You know, if one hasn't got the gas safety certificate, go and help them get it. Don't jump on them straight away and fine them straight away for not having one. So perhaps look at that side of things. So being supportive and helpful, you know, in the first instance, because this will hopefully uncover bad ones, the serious ones, but you need to target our resources to make them be
I mean, in terms of the actual, setting up the scheme, most of it is set down in legislation in terms of the requirements to obtain a licence. So the Housing Act very clearly says that there has to be adequate, satisfactory management arrangements in place. The property has to be suitable for occupation, and that means things around room sizes, facilities, that kind of stuff. It also talks about the licence holder and any managers being fit and proper, so that's around criminality, that kind of thing. So it's absolutely explicit in the Housing Act in terms of the decision making to grant a licence. And then once a licence is granted, then the set of conditions that can be applied, again, there's a range of mandatory licences and some discretionary ones as well. And then also there's things around appeals and statutory timings, that kind of thing. So a lot of it is set down in statute that we don't have any wiggle room in terms of changing the profile of the scheme. I think what we can do is, we really want to make sure that we're engaging with landlords and tenants as we go through this process. And we've talked about having review periods and things like that, so that we can see how the scheme's going. So we don't want to sort of take engagement away from this whole process. And I think at the core of this is for us to support compliant landlords so that they have a common set of standards, that they all know what they're working to, but actually to enable us to go and get the poor non-compliant landlords quicker than we are at the minute. And that's at the core of this work. So I understand what you're saying about co-design, because I think obviously that is really, really important. But I think with such a statutory scheme, it's actually really, really difficult to do that in the way that perhaps you're suggesting. But we're open to discussing it as we, if the scheme is adopted, to think about how we review it, how we talk to people about it, how we engage with it.
I can just jump in here. I think the point here is that you're making is that it's a very prescriptive legislation, so there's not much room for co-design. But I think with all of these policies, as we're committed to co-design, if we're not going to co-design because we think there's a good reason not to, I think that should be, and this is not just a point for you and your department, just council-wide, given our commitment to consulting people, there ought to be an explanation about why you're not doing it before you embark on it. That is effective, and for my leadership team, I'll make that point to them. Right.
Probably another point for the paper, I guess. To
Yes,
add
the
paragraph.
paper. So do explain. Yes, thank you, Greg. Tom.
Thanks very firstly, just a point of clarification. Am I right in saying that this scheme would not make anything illegal that is currently legal? Rather, it will check that people are adhering to standards that already exist and give them sort of a stamp of approval saying, yes, you're meeting those standards. Yeah. So, following on from that, I wonder, I know there are some stats in the paper, but I wonder what percentage of properties will fail that, and fail that in ways which, let's say, the core of what we're trying to tackle here, really underperforming properties. So, for example, my property, our property manager, after Grenfell fire, decided we should get a fire safety check. We had a fire safety consultant came around, and you said you failed because you have a fire extinguisher. Fire extinguishers are dangerous because people don't know how to use them. and the delay in calling the fire brigade. This was a licensed fire safety consultant. So they removed our fire extinguisher, and that was the totality of what they did. So I would argue that's not that helpful, but there are obviously properties out there that are underperforming and are genuinely understandable. And if the percentage is low enough, I just wonder whether perhaps we're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and have we considered the option of instead increasing awareness amongst renters as to their rights and their ability to contact the council. I know some of, through me, I've referred to your department, and your department's done a great job in going in and speaking with those landlords and forcing them to get up to standard. And I appreciate a lot of people aren't aware, but was that an option considered, just to increase the awareness?
Just before you answer, I mean, I suppose just from my own reflections of being in the property world, I think an awful lot of the time tenants don't know what is right or what is legal within a home. So, and often landlords don't know. To be honest, there's been times even in my own life where it was only until the agent pointed out that I hadn't got one of the requisite forms in order to rent my home out that I realised I didn't, for instance. So, I suppose there's a asymmetry of knowledge on this as well.
Yeah.
Where tenants perhaps don't necessarily know that the home is unfit for habitation. They may have a very good idea that it is, but some of the checks are perhaps a little bit more, what's the word, slightly more nuanced than they are obvious. Clearly, as a picture show, if you have a tree growing through the window, that's very different than expired for. But I'll leave officers to answer slightly more technically.
Okay, well, a good example is if you have got a decent agent that's renting a property out, that have done the checks, that have gas safety, the pack testing, electrical installation, that have made sure there's smoke alarms included, ideally like hot light, etc. They'll ask the freehold if it's okay for the person to rent out the property, because sometimes that's not actually allowed at the lease. They've done all those things. And they're not the guys we're after. So it's people that maybe, so not a million miles from here, we did an inspection at Hyde Park Gates, and all the people in there, probably none of them realised they had any rights whatsoever. Got the fire door to the kitchen, so that's a fire door in the kitchen, it's propped open, you can actually close it. I think one of them was, police took all the drugs out in the van, so and the guys who were just living there and working locally and paying their rent in cash at the end of the week, whatever the sort of dodgy deal was, they've got no idea. So it's only through sort of regulating properly that we've picked those up. We don't know how many there are out there, but we come across this all the time. And unfortunately, we're still in the shadow of Navara. So with Navara, we actually stopped helping a lot of residents because the pushback for the resident providers was we wouldn't deal with them at all. And it kind of filtered back. We weren't really helping residents. And then we just didn't have any staff when Navara finished. We were sort of trying to rebuild the team. We're now in a position where the numbers of complaints begin to come up and reflect that's where it should have been 5 years ago. As in just a general thing, 2,500 complaints a year from residents doesn't sound really a lot. Look at the data report, page 70, I think. It just summarises the volume of private rented accommodation we have in the borough, and the possibilities of the high risk thing, actually being there. And we don't have, this has been run for 5 years. We have a great 5 years, we don't have to really go there again. We can have different ways of doing ups and downs.
Yeah.
And then, if you're a good landlord, you pay once, 5 years, it's done. Bad landlords, we want a license for a year or 2 years, and you want to pay it, you want to carry on renting, you have to pay again. So it's trying to deal with those issues that you've raised. But until we get in there and check them, until we can inspect them, gas safety certificate, it doesn't just get filed. So I'm just going to look at it and go, right, has it passed, or was there a recommendation? There's a recommendation. What can you know about that? So that helps you judge what the landlord's doing, taking responsibility.
If I may just a quick follow-up, just, I certainly agree that having that ability to give 5 years for someone who's obviously a good landlord and just maybe 1 or 2 years for someone who we're more suspicious of is very good flexibility, definitely improves the scheme. I do just wonder though whether, self-reporting can be a good way of doing it. And again, we won't capture everything, but we might capture the worst things, especially if we improve awareness. I don't know if people landlords put up a sign or something making people aware of their rights. But if we can improve awareness amongst people who are less likely to be aware of their rights, then we can improve self-reporting. Anyway, it's just a thought. And then the second option, so very quickly, was are there, perhaps the legislation doesn't allow us, but you're talking about the soft touch approach initially. Is there any possibility to run it initially as a pilot? Or, I've noticed from going around the borough, going into lots of properties, sort of campaigning and helping residents, and it's no surprise that generally it's the less expensive properties which are more likely to be in bad condition. When you're wealthy, you can afford to choose. When you're poorer, you often have less choice. So, is there any argument to sort of set a rental limit, say above a certain rent? It's less likely to be a problem.
Shall I just jump on the sort of the soft touch element? It's something we've been discussing is obviously the model is something of cost recovery. That's the idea of the scheme. So it's sort of self-funding. The council could, of course, choose to sort of subsidise the first couple of months, years, however it may be, in order to sort of identify those people that we believe are the really poor landlords, or perhaps to identify the good landlords quickly, so that we don't then necessarily have to sort of spend much more time with them. There would obviously be a sort of an inherent cost to us in creating that officer resource. I do take the point that, of course, if you're an excellent landlord, and you've done everything correctly, you will be paying for an additional piece of paperwork to go along with your sort of property. But I suppose it's sort of, I think the analogy I go along with is sort of MOTing the car, is that you may believe you're sort of maintaining your car to a very high standard, but you still have to get it checked and to make sure that it is up to roadworthiness. And I think the same is true for sort of housing condition. It is always, I personally think it is worth having somebody else come to inspect your home to make sure it is up to the standard. And if I was to put a number on it, it's very hard to sort of classify, but I think £20 a month is probably a fair rate to make sure that you are above board, really. But I think the rest of your point could be done by.
It is.
Sorry.
Well, no, but let's keep it crisp.
Sure.
It is quite nuanced in dealing with a licensing scheme. So what we will find is that those really compliant landlords, there may be a few things that actually they do need to look at, and officers will support them to make sure that that's okay, and then we'll move on, and then we can get to the non-compliant landlords quicker. Also, sometimes tenants complain about issues that aren't issues, which also causes problems for landlords. So having that sort of mark of accreditation, license, whatever you want to call it, also supports them in a way as well. So it is quite a nuanced approach when you actually get into detail.
Thank you. Cassie.
Thank you, Chair. I think what you've mentioned in terms of the council committed to health homes and homes fit for human habitation is the policy that we have taken. And as Councillor Hammond mentioned, yes, for politics, but it's worth mentioning that I was the one who introduced that motion and actually moved that motion of health homes to give everyone the best possible chance of life in Kensington and Chelsea, especially children who were born in our borough and will be educated, that hopefully will be contributing to this country. So the main policy at the time was 3 main issues: housing fit for human habitation, and health advocacy, health homes, mainly within the council homes at the time, as well as housing associations. But this paper covers the most important one, which is again a private rented section that we could not get at the time, get hold of them. I'm pleased to say that this will cover most of the policies. You've mentioned the paper on page 28 as well as page 70 that private rent has been increasing for the last, let's say, 10 years or so, from 27% to 44%, almost jumped quite significantly. I wonder if you could tell me the percentage of from housing from homelessness into private homes, whether in the borough or out of borough. I could not see in the paper that covered well. So could you please tell me, my first question, how many of this percentage were people on the housing list, as well as people who became homeless but they moved within the borough and they now are classified as private rented residents?
We'd have to go back to Dan Hawthorne's area.
Yeah.
It's a code yard, so we don't have that.
That's the reason I thank you. I hope to get that in writing in time. The reason I'm asking this is very important because people who are quite, let's say, well off or have the means to rent homes, they actually go there and visit and actually deal with, or maybe get someone to check their homes. People who are really in need and mostly low income in our borough do not have that luxury and may not get an opportunity to be checked and properly, very decent standard where it's a fit for human habitation or someone to live. So that's important to know whether we are managing to get people from common housing register into the private and be checked and be dealing with some of them as we are aware of. Within 28, the poor housing conditions is widespread, as we mentioned, almost as we know, nearly 90,000 properties in the borough, homes in the borough, and almost half of them, 39,000, close to 40,000, are privately rented properties, and 1/4 of them have a significant issue with a widespread issue with poor housing condition. Again, we're talking about, although these are numbers and figures, we're talking about people living in our borough and going through tonight, this evening as we speak, having these conditions. What can these policies do immediately to support them for those who are in need, or what system is in place at the moment? Yes, just to finish up with that point.
Yeah, I mean, just on one element, I think you mentioned sort of the council's housing policy. I can't imagine, I don't believe that the council would house people in an HMO, and that we generally offer single tenancies, but I'm happy to check that. And then do points you made about the rise of
There's a
PRS.
couple of points that you're going to come back to us on, whether we ever put someone in an HMO and there was one for that. Okay, so we'll get back to you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
the one with the poor condition.
Will, did you have any questions?
Yes.
Will, yep.
Yeah, okay. One point, I believe that we should focus on 254 to start with, do it well. And then if there needs to be a review about 257, take that experience. Because I think your point you made about sensible sized job, do that well, learn the lessons, and move on. Secondly, when you're doing this work, and you mentioned agents, do you have a particular program of talking to agents so that they do have knowledge themselves and checklists they pass on? My experience has been working with some good agents. They do actually have a checklist that they give to me as a landlord, and they actually go through it and have you done these things, and they'll send one or people around to check that you have done them. We want evidence of that before we proceed with helping you in place. So that's one question. The other question is on the 257 ones. It seems to me that there are some complexities that have not been addressed in the report around freehold, leasehold, and rental. And you can get leases and subleases ad nauseam in some of these houses. And it would be it's going to be a difficult area legally and managerially to deal with. So I think that's complexity. It's really probably more a normalization of the question. I think the key question I would ask is, do you work with agents to ensure this checklist? Because I think this is a good practice. We could get more.
We do in a very general sense, absolutely. And the National Landlords Forum, which is kind of mixed in with this agency part of that. They like the standards, so they like to be the ones holding it up. John D. Woods of this world, etc., because they are driving for the high standards for agents and tenants.
Thank you. I've got a couple of, or just a comment on the paper in 5.7.1, the third paragraph. I think it's something somebody else mentioned, but it says the team's seen a significant rise in service requests. I think it would be really helpful to have a little bit more specifics around that. How many, what the percentage increase is and what sort of thing. And the other question is, I just couldn't quite get my head around. You're going to give someone a licence for 5 years. are you going to make everyone apply for a licence on day one and then go and visit them at some point in 5 years? How's that going to work? Maybe I should have picked it up from the paper. I couldn't really.
I mean, there will be considerable communication out to people that we've already consulted with, obviously, which is landlords, managing agents, and likewise. We will give people the opportunity to come forward to apply for their licence. If we do come across landlords who haven't applied for the licence, obviously then we give them an opportunity. So there needs to be a period of time to allow the scheme to get enough publication that people are aware of it. So it will be very much what as we do at the moment. If we come across for mandatory licensing, if we come across a landlord who hasn't licensed, we will.
No, but what my question is, you apply for a licence, and does someone immediately come and inspect your property, or do you get a licence without an inspection and then have to have an inspection later?
Right. So how it will work is when you apply for a licence, there's a wide range of information that you have to provide to us, which is done online. We will assess that, we will risk assess it, and we look at some key risk factors. If we think it's high risk, for example, the gas safety certificate isn't adequate, we will inspect. If it's lower risk, we will get to it a little bit later down the line. We will licence it, but we will apply certain conditions at that point. So it might be that we'll go and visit in 3 months' time, in 6 months' time. So it's really risk-based.
Okay, so that might be helpful as well.
Yeah, which I
because
think
otherwise
Councillor Hammond mentioned that as well.
I think I just still haven't got my head around it, so that's great. Those are all my questions. I think the sense of the committee is a strong feeling of, there ought to be a do-nothing option, but we probably support a Section 254 licensing system, but there isn't much support at this point for a Section 257 licensing regime. There might be at some point in the future, but definitely not now. Is that fair? Is that a fair enough summary of our thoughts?
Pretty strong on 257. Could I ask a factual question?
Yes,
As it were?
please.
Sorry, Mary.
And then we'll bring it to
I
close.
should have thought of this one earlier. Obviously, it's aimed at private landlords. Does that include social landlords, so housing associations, if their properties would qualify? So under
No.
257, where there are quite a lot of conversion properties, would they be obliged?
They're exempt by
Are they?
statute. They're exempt. What we may, if I can make Chair, what we may pick up in the 257s, we may end up picking up some flats in multiple occupation within those 257s, which we would then, within any proposed scheme, would be able to consider then. But that would be like a flat in multiple occupation on its own within section 257. So we wouldn't be looking at the whole property, we'd just be looking at one letting.
Well, presumably there could be a 254 within one.
Exactly. So there are some complications there, but that could happen.
Right, but the exemption for housing registered housing associations.
They're exempted.
I don't know, sounds going.
So I was then going to say, do any other councillors in attendance want to ask questions? Happy? Any questions from members? We've got no members of the public, so no questions from them. So thank you very much to officers for coming in, submitting such a long and detailed, but I think that just is a sign of how important we think it is, and there's clearly support for some of what you're suggesting. So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. We're going to move on to paper A5, which updates the council's latest financial position, and invite Councillor Johnny Ponicitis and Karen swap around with notes. So this shows our financial position at the end of the first quarter, end of 2022, against the budget that was set in March, along with the forecast for the remainder of the year. So would you like to read it?
Yes, I'm happy to. Can I start by paying tribute to the lead member who produced quite so skillful
I'm
budget,
not going to fall for that one.
and
That's
indeed the
flannel.
council officers who have drafted a very skillful report in relation to that budget. I think the paper broadly speaks for itself, so I don't want to take up too much time. I do think it's encouraging that given all of the headwinds we're facing, we're looking at a modest overspend, but it's still an overspend, so we do need to bear down. Clearly, there are medium-term and long-term risks as well to the council's financial position, which we're working very hard to mitigate. But no, I'm content to really field questions on the paper. the majority of departments are broadly in line with the budget that's allocated to them. There are, within that, there are some fluctuations, and I think that's what we need to focus our energy.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, Will, do you want to kick off? Chairman of our working group.
Yes, I mean, it's the sense I get from the report is that this year's okay. Next year will be a little bit more difficult with some percentage cuts, and that thereafter things get perhaps very different, more strategic. And the question that comes to my mind, or a general overall question, is that how come it seems to be okay, although we were told before, when the budget was being prepared last year, that it was tight, and that it was, we had 2% inflation built in. And since then, we've had Ukraine, 5, 10, 15% inflation. Anybody's guessed that, I would like to know the answer. But it's certainly going to be a lot higher than 2%. And then alongside that, thing that our chair has been very keen on is KPIs for performance. But in general sense, here in this budget, we assume that we're doing well in performance terms. We have a lot of unfilled posts in various departments. I understand 50 or 60 in E&C. If we've got all these unfilled posts, do we actually need those posts, or when we fill them and pay for people to occupy them, will we be more overspent than we are? And so I can't, out of the reports, actually get a sense of grip of how tight things really are, even in this year, let alone in the years going forwards. Because there are just so many unknowns. And there are deferred projects, or as when I was in Whitehall, they were called rolling projects, which if they manage to finance them, one year for another. So I would like some more light to be shed on where the sense of reality is. I think this is not an accusation that things are being done incorrectly or improperly, but it isn't transparent in reading this information as to exactly where we are. We're in the middle of the biggest financial crisis that has never been faced ever, or since the Second World War, and yet we seem to be very comfortable with managing it through this year, which in some ways is good. And on the other hand, makes me wonder whether there was an awful lot of money in the system, which is dynamic, if you like, which is being managed in a way that means that we don't actually have a crisis this week or next week.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think you started by talking about the present situation being broadly comfortable, and although there are clearly enormous headwinds, we are in a reasonable position. I think you're right that in order to manage the medium-term and long-term financial risks, we do need to try and pivot from the sorts of savings we've been making this year, probably, to a more transformation-led approach. And that's a structural challenge for the whole council. It's something that I will be appealing to fellow lead members to look at in more detail, and will welcome the budget working group scrutiny on. I think on the in some ways, as you say, it's praised. In others, in a different sense, it suggests that there's an ambiguity around certain elements of the budget. I think there's been very good stewardship over previous years of our finances, and for that reason, there is some contingency in the budgets. There's probably some caution as well, and that creates a fiscal headroom that has allowed us to approach this year in a fairly strong position. We can see that there was a contingency set aside. Even with that, there's a modest overspend. So we can see that things like inflation and the energy crisis are affecting our budgets, as they will be every budget in the government. And over the coming years, we'll need to review the extent to which we can provide the same contingency, how we use reserves to, at different points, ameliorate the pressures that exist. But on the whole, I think we have been fortunate to have been in such good hands for so long.
Can only take so much.
Well, no, I mean it sincerely. In relation to vacancies, I think it's a really interesting question, because I do think that on the whole, the council provides a very good level of service. there will be individual services that people have individual issues with, and in a small number of cases, things that we do want to structurally improve. But we are, I think, a reasonably well-run council, and so it does, in relation to those sort of transformational and structural savings that we'll need to make, beg the question, well, have we got the right base budget in terms of staffing in each department? Are there vacancies where actually the need has changed? Because our demographics are evolving all the time. The census showed that. And I don't think any service should be static. So we should be reviewing that. And that's one of the things, again, I want all league members to be considering as they set about sort of being as efficient and value for money driven as they can possibly be. I mean, we do need to make sure that we've got the highest possible level of service within the budgets we've got, and ensure that things like healthy homes and safety are of paramount importance in everything we do. But I do think there are areas in which we can be a bit more robust in terms of looking at those levels.
Can I ask a supplementary? I think with what I'm searching for, perhaps it's more transparency. I understand good stewardship and headroom and contingency and so on, as being a component of this. But it would be very useful if one can understand what, if you like, the core expenditure was, and that everything that is flexible or fungible, that it can actually be in a pot called contingency or reserves or whatever, but actually the budgeting for operational, because we're looking to try to improve our value for money and KPIs on that, and that needs to be benchmarked against other authorities and so on. So how many officers we have to do a certain kind of operation, what standards we do. I know we do some things to a higher standard, and so on. And where we have contingencies, the contingencies and reserves need to be a bit more explicit. At the moment, the norm is that we have a percentage figure agreed for what used to be called Star Chamber, it's now called something else, no doubt. It's 2%, so you have to look for 2%. Once you've got 2%, well, that's fine. Okay, apart from being asked the question about, can you do any more than that, the answer to which is obviously no. That's the sort of style of the way it works. Whereas if there was a bottom-up, this is what's actually needed, and on top of that is a prudent contingency, and then we hold something in reserve, then you wouldn't have a ring-fenced budget.
Zero-based budgeting. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm happy to, but it looks like you also do, so I'll be brief. I mean, I know that there is a lot of benchmarking work that happens within the council. We have got benchmarking on many of our services. Empower also help us with that, and so there are external mechanisms by which we're able to benchmark the work that we do. Like you said, there are some areas where we do invest more than lots of other authorities, but our outcomes are also very high. So a really good example of that is our social care caseworker caseload, which is among the lowest in, as far as I'm aware. But our outcomes across family and children's services are really high. And I think that's a really positive thing for this council to be proud of in terms of the way that we look after our children and make sure that people who are vulnerable have access to all of the support that they need. So I think that covers benchmarking to an extent. And I think the latter point, which alludes to the blunt instrument of target setting, is probably covered to an extent by my previous remarks, in which I set out that I would prefer over the medium term to move from a target-led approach to one of transformation.
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
Tom. Oh, sorry, Tom.
Sorry.
Did you want to add something?
So just a couple of comments actually. In terms of the forward-looking, what I would say, it's going to become increasingly more challenging. I think that as an authority, we've probably taken quite a lot of what we would refer to often as that low-hanging fruit. So some of the easier savings we have been able to deliver in previous years, I do think that position is changing absolutely. And as Johnny says, you'll see kind of at a future meeting the budget proposals going forward for next year. But I do think 24-25 is going to be particularly challenging, mainly because of some wider changes in the local government sector. So we do know that there will be changes in our funding coming forward. We were expecting that, and I feel like I've been saying it for the last 3 years or 4 years. It has been delayed. We have had a kind of a pandemic in the middle, but I do absolutely believe that will come. And I think as a council, we probably need to be planning for 24-25 for that to really hit. Just wanted to touch on the current year and just picking up on the transparency. We did get a better finance settlement than what we'd expected for 22-23. So we were able to put a much higher contingency away, give it on the basis that when we set the budget, the inflation level probably was still 2% at that time, but it very, very quickly moved quite quickly after. But I think we kind of saw the writing on the wall with that. It is shown separately, and I think we've even got to have it now showing it in the reports. What I would say in terms of the current year is this is the position at the end of Q1 where we're seeing some of those impacts coming through. It's probably energy prices starting to see an impact. Probably the biggest impact is in our capital programme. In terms of the cost of, so in terms of inflation on our general contract, I do think the worst is probably still to come. So it'd be really interesting to see what the position is in Q2 and Q3. But we do have that contingency, but it's only set aside for 1 year at the moment, so we do need to think about that going forward. Just on the cost of living, in terms of demand pressures, I again think we will see some of that more in the autumn. Generally, we're not seeing those great pressures coming through yet, so just would really emphasise that it's just quite early on in the year, but I think there are three main lists. There's inflation, there's cost of living and demand pressures. And just generally, as we say, what's going to happen in future years. But, you know, benchmarking absolutely, I think, is going to play a really important feature of particularly the work of the budget working group and the work of the members looking at how do we compare to others, because there will be other authorities that spend less than us but achieve the same outcome. So we absolutely have to challenge ourselves on those aspects, and that's where value comes.
Tom.
Thanks, Rita. Just a couple of questions. First one, following on from Will's point. I mean, it is human nature to, especially in a large organisation, when you're in control of the department, not to want that department to get smaller, and thus lots and lots of the large majority of organisations, directors want to not underspend because the next step is your budget gets cut for the next year. Do you feel we have a culture of not just delivering great services, which I think you do, as you talked about, but people identifying savings for either for ratepayers or savings in their department, which can then be put into future investment?
I think that's a work in progress. I don't think that's something that we've mastered. I think over a long period, this authority has been managed very well financially. And so probably we haven't felt to the same extent as some other authorities the acute pressure in terms of our budgets. But you know, we are not immune from those external impacts. And so over the medium term going forward, I think we will need to get better at that. And again, that's one of the challenges I think needs to be put to every department in the council.
That's good to hear.
You have one more question, sorry,
Yeah,
before I
yeah, sorry, one more
discuss
quick one. But it's good to hear, just on that, so cultural change is one of the most difficult things to do.
I agree.
But it's good to see that we're heading in that direction. On 1.5 of the paper, which is page 138, and I've just brought this up as an example. When the cleaning service is brought in-house, it's this new structure is in place for costs of 350,000 higher than expected. I assume that's annual costs rather than upfront costs, but correct me if I'm wrong. I just wonder, in cases like that, obviously when that decision was made, I assume there's a cost-benefit analysis done based on a projected cost, and it comes in fairly significantly higher than expected. Is our practice to then review that cost benefits analysis again and look at that decision again?
Me to come in, yeah. So that's also in relation to the housing revenue account, but the same principle I think applies across the general fund and the housing revenue account. So when a service of that size comes in, you will do your best to estimate what the cost is coming into the council. It can quite often be costed as is, so there will be two implications. It has come in significantly higher, as it says in the paper, but the HRA is under significant pressure, I think, as much as what the general fund is. So I think in answer to your question, it is an area that will always have to be looked at as to whether that pressure wasn't anticipated. We do have that pressure now, and what is it we can mitigate going forward? But quite often, particularly when whole services are brought in, they're kind of transferred into the council as is, rather than almost being able to do that full restructure. It's not a service that's under your control.
Okay, so you would hope that in subsequent years, you'll be able to reduce that.
Yeah, and I know we're picking up particular service there, but what I would say generally is in that particular example, but all examples, every single service will be needing to look at the HRA and the general fund, looking at how they do things more efficiently. And I would say the HRA is almost under as much pressure as what the general fund is. So it's almost absolutely has to be given that value for money principle applied.
Yeah, it's just, I suppose, a general point, because you make a decision based on projected figures. They, for whatever reason, don't turn out to be the case. Do we, it'd be easier than just sort of let it ride out. Do we have that practice? Looking back,
I agree. And also in relation to the capital programme and slippage there, which I know that we've looked at over a period already and made progress on, but I think there's still progress to make, and making sure that we are learning the lessons and delivering things in a timely way.
Thank you, Cousin.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of, I do agree with Councillor Pascal as he mentioned in terms of transparency and figures and what we need to do as scrutiny chairs, committees, black and white of how the finance is being managed. At the same time, I'm just curious, because crisis of energy crisis and cost of living, and we don't seem to be doing very bad. There must be something we're doing right, if not all other councils of the country must be doing something wrong.
I think that's an adroit point.
In that note, 1.5, 1.3, page 135, and also page 137. Can you elaborate a bit more on the digital fund program, which has been underspent for £31 million, and how that came about?
That's the slippage I was referring to. That the capital programme is larger than the set of schemes we have made progress on delivering, and I regret that, because everything in the capital programme has explicit support from the leadership team and indeed the council when it's based on as part of the budget process. So I've articulated that I hope we can get a lot better at delivering things in a timely way, and if necessary, if we don't have the capacity to deliver things at the pace on this scale of a programme, then maybe we do need to focus down and prioritise within that programme and say perhaps it's larger than we can bear at the moment, and so do we need to look at rephasing things, and where are our real flagship priorities and how can we define those through our programme.
Thank you. Greg.
Sorry, my apologies. One more question.
Sorry.
In terms of, I'll just add two questions in. In terms of which is more important, savings, also providing a service that is decent for residents. That's one. Second point, since we're doing very well in terms of financing, it's about time. Do you think that our staff been working very hard over the last years in terms of COVID and others, cost of living and energy crisis? It's about time for them to have a pay rise, whether it's council employees as well as contracted employees, to make sure that they can go through this difficult time. Can we make that adjustment? Okay.
It would probably be unfair to ask Tara to respond to that. I understand that's part of the negotiation, and that those negotiations are ongoing and it happens nationally. But I do join you in paying tribute to our council officers who have done a phenomenal job over the past couple of years, much longer as well, but in particular the last couple of years where we have had coronavirus, actually before that, the recovery from the Grenfell tragedy, which is again an ongoing process, and now the energy crisis and cost of living. So no, I join you in that sentiment.
Can I just add to that? So just in terms of, Councillor Fowler-Seaty has mentioned negotiations on the pay increase, so that will be a national agreement. So currently negotiations are at 5%. We won't know until I think probably November, December time what the outcome of that, but whatever those outcomes are, that will follow through for council staff. Just wanted to also flag about contractors as well. So we've got council commitment to London Living Wage. So as the London Living Wage increases, then our that filters through in terms of the staff costs that we pay within a contract. And some of our contracts, actually, when you look at them in detail, the increase to staff mirrors obviously what the council staff are paid. So quite often that translates itself to contract. Other contracts are and this is one we're keeping a very close eye on, are linked to CPI as well. So obviously we've seen CPI, it's very high level. So what I would say is it might appear that the forecast is in a good position at the moment, but I think we have got quite a rocky couple of quarters coming through. But I would say about the contingency, we kind of predicted that right at the end of setting the budget. So we have got that contingency provision. Whether it will be sufficient, I think is a big question mark, but we have got that contingency for the current year. Next year, obviously, is something that we'll be talking about over the next few months, and what is that prudent level that we should be setting aside each year.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Mary. I took up a lot of time in the last item, so I was going to let Johnny and Torin off the hook after this time. Just a comment, really, building what Torin just said. We're only just entering a period of high inflation. And I'm old enough just about to remember the 1980s, the 1970s and early 1980s, which was a sustained period of high inflation. So we're certainly not out of the woods. We don't know if the current inflation is a transitory one or an embedded one. We're not going to know for some time yet. So what thought have you given to how we operate in a period of high inflation, if that's what we've got?
Let's start.
Okay, can start.
Yeah. So actually, the next report that you see, I think at your next meeting in November, we will be bringing, as well as budget proposals, an update on our financial forecast, particularly focusing on next year, but then the following couple of years. And we are absolutely, I think, pay and contract inflation is really at the heart of our discussions at the moment. The piece of work. So what I would say is in previous years, when inflation was low, you could make some global assumptions around what you thought some of those cost pressures were going forward. I think we're in a different position now. So, for example, on our contracts, not all of our contracts will be impacted by CPI. Say some will be linked to, say, the pay increase, which could be 5.5%, it could be 6%, but that's very different to some of our energy contracts where we could see in construction, we could see 25%, 30% increases. So we are doing quite a detailed piece of work, almost not quite line by line contracts, but almost putting them into particular groups in terms of what the impact of inflation will be. Because I think if you applied a global assumption around CPI on all your contracts, it would be really difficult for us to set a balanced budget. But actually, the reality is it wouldn't hit every contract in the same way. So that's the more detailed work that I would say probably shifts us from the approach that we've taken in previous years, where we've had low inflation, to one much higher now. The other thing that we are, and again, this is all really for next year, going into 23-24, really looking at what some of those demand pressures will be. So we're not seeing that real increase in demand. We keep talking about, we expect to see lots more kind of presenting at our front door as homeless. We're not seeing that massive increase in demand yet, but we're keeping a really close eye as to what that looks like going into the summer, because as you say, it's probably going to be quite a sustained period into 23-24. So that's what I would say. It's just a bit more forensic, the analysis we do, but it is still assumptions. It's really difficult to say with any precision exactly what will be, but that's again where your contingency and reserves come in, because you just can't predict it.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing that piece of work.
I'd like to make some comments. I'd just like to make sort of three comments really. One is 10.6, the COVID recovery framework. I hate ring-fence budgets, as far as you know. And this last sentence in here reminds me why I hate them. That we haven't spent very much, so we'll find something else to spend it on. I just want to be absolutely certain that if we do decide to that we cut it off, we say we didn't spend all we want to do, and debate how else we spend it, rather than it just happening. I was very comforted by what Torin said, because one of my questions was going to be on 10.8. So it's a bit vague. We're talking about, pressures and what they're going to be, and I'm really pleased to learn of your approach to modelling. And I think typing contracts together and looking at it that way is much the most sensible way of approaching it. It's a sort of risk basis really, and that makes sense. And the only other comment I wanted to make was, quite a lot of these budgets contain enormous swings in them, ups and downs. So although the bottom line changes look quite minimal, I'm looking particularly at environmental services and ASC. They are hiding some really, I'm not suggesting you're hiding them at all, but we need to think about them in terms of that enormous pressure in ASC on placements. and you know, obviously lack of cooperation with, lack of funds maybe from the NHS, and that those we really need at some point to really think about perhaps examining those in more detail, or the committees do. Well, you wanted to add
Yeah,
something?
one final thing on that. So there's a talk between Tom and I. Last year, we helped enormously, Karen, with the ESC work, identifying the costs of the commitment the council has made in 2019 to the 2030 our own operations. There is some reflection of that in the schools programme here, and I don't see the £100 million in the HRA being made provision for going forward.
So you wouldn't see it necessarily in this report. So the reason you're seeing the schools is because we want to bring that out of the pipeline. The surveys in schools have started. This report is really in the current year, so what you're missing, and actually I'll come on to a question to the Scrutiny Committee after, is that forward looking. So it's absolutely in the programme, it's within the HRA, but you're only seeing the current year, so it will be in 23, 24 and 24,
So
25.
the reality is, if I read that correctly, is that the 2019 commitment for a 10-year process to get us through our own operations to net zero has gone 3 years of the 10 years without there being any real progress on the ground, apart from schools, which has been brought forward.
Which has been brought out of the pipeline.
So you now have a 10-year commitment, which has to be done in 7 years. Just to flag that.
Did you want to add something?
Can I just, yeah, because I should have said it at the beginning actually, this is probably the first, well, this is the first time that we've brought the financial position report to the Scrutiny Committee. I think that's absolutely right, it's the right approach before it goes on to leadership team. Every 6 months you will see it with performance as well as finance information, so the next update, that's good. So I think, you know, the question around kind of performance and KPIs is really important. What you're seeing today is almost a draft leadership team report. We can maybe do some work outside the committee about just picking up on the hidden, you know, the hidden variations, or the variations between, the masked variations between the individual services as to whether this is the right format of Bravery and Scrutiny Committee, or whether we just bring something a little bit more detailed where it allows you to, it's a bit more visible, because it's all within the appendix.
It's all absolutely there.
But it's about how we pull it out into the front covering report. So it's a bit of a work in progress, but it'd be really good to get some feedback outside the meeting from the committee about how they.
Actually, yeah, just a point on that. It'd be great to have something on the website that residents would engage with. That is really easy to use. I always thought, because most people have no idea what government money is spent on. Did a survey on this. People guessed that about 20% of the national budget went on MP salary.
There's no accounting for folk, is there?
Yeah, so something really easy to engage with for instance.
I mean, really, this, you know, we ought to be reading this carefully, and adult social care ought to be going off and worrying about those pressures. And I mean, the select committee, but we'll leave that to them. Any members of any other councillors like Jen want to comment, or any members of the family? Good. Karen, is this going to be your last OSC? So can I just record the huge thanks of everybody who's ever been involved in a working party, ever been a lead member or anything else, to you, because I think you've brought a new element of transparency and openness, and a very and an ability to articulate some really quite complicated for me, but, issues in a way that we can all understand, and that's added enormously to scrutiny. So a heartfelt thank you from me and the rest of the committee.
And also from the lead member and the leadership team.
Congratulations on your well-deserved
Elevation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good. Well, we're going to move on to work budget. I don't think we need to tell you any longer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So move on to paper A6. All right, I'll skip over. In mind. Good. So this is the review of our approach to project scrutiny, and members of the working group. I think there could be some amendments to that. But Will, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, what we said at the last meeting is that Jackie and I would come forward with all the stuff from Jackie. And I have to say thank you, Jackie, because you did most of the work on this. And we've had briefings from Barry Quirk and from Taryn as background to this, plus the fact that I've spoken to each of the chairs of the select committee reflecting Mary's suggestion last time, that the budget working group should involve each of the select committees. And therefore, I suggested that certainly the chairs of the committees should come to a first meeting of the budget working group, and to bring with them another person from that select committee if they so wish, either because they've agreed already, as in one select committee, to delegate to somebody else in the committee, or because there's another person who may or may not be the person who's delegated, or that the chair might wish to continue. I have no prejudice as to who should be involved. That's purely a decision for the chair and the select committee to make in their own context. But the structure of this is that we want to have then, after an initial meeting, briefing, to have separate meetings with each of the select committees to focus in on the areas of that select committee and their own budget with their officers from that area of discipline. Whether we can do this before Terence departs or not is really quite good. If we can, it would be fantastic, Jackie, if we can engineer that for. Because I think particularly the first meeting, that Jackie can bring, that Taryn can bring us up to speed as a group in the thinking. Just, you and Taryn were saying earlier on about how we might, different ways of looking at this, and I think you have a very clear view overall, and can bring us as a group up to speed, and then we can decide how we want to pursue there afterwards with the individual select. So the idea is that we will do the core work, which is as previous years, to look at construction of the budget, which will be decided upon in the spring. That's the sort of core. The second thing is that we will look at the progress of previous year's budget to now, and by the time we get later in the year, we'll have a better knowledge of this year. And then we'll look at future years beyond next year's preparation, and particularly focus on some of the strategic questions that Taryn and Barry have indicated to Jackie Heard and myself that we're going to have to think round the questions that we can ask, not for us to make policy, but we need to challenge the leadership team to address strategic issues that are coming in. So that'll be the method of working through a year. This is set out in this paper, including even some suggested names who'd like to participate. So really, the question today is, are you happy with this, or do you wish to debate it or take it in a different direction?
Thank you. Jackie, have you got anything to add to that? Yeah. I know that Greg's already indicated to me that he's over-committed for membership of the committee, but so just to note that, because his name is so clearly written down here.
It's entirely personal reasons. I'm having a bit of a difficult year at the moment. And
I hope that we can informally still send you a
So
paper.
does any other member of the committee have any?
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Is everyone happy that that's the way we proceed? Or is anyone good? I think I am. So thank you very much. That's agreed. And now we're moving on to the forward plan. So I had I should have invited questions from any other councillors and members of the public about the Scrutiny work programme, but you haven't all leapt up and that's great. We're on the forward plan pre-decision. Just to mention here that I did email the leadership lead members about giving us more notice, particularly about policy and strategy development, when it was a twinkle in their eye rather than a kind of fully fledged, no, I'm going to get on to terrible trouble with analogy, but you know what I mean, I'm going to start like that. And also about encouragement to support us with KPIs, because I know that all chairmen have been concentrating on that. So we move to the key decision track. Did anyone pick up? So if you go through page by page. So the first comment I had, if anyone else had one before, is page 206. In fact, Dunstan, maybe you can help us. The enforcement policy for the Environmental Health Service group. And I hadn't heard of this, nobody seems to have heard of this one at all before. and yet it's coming as a policy. What is it, and should we look at it?
Well, it was fairly news to me, I would have to add. It is a policy we have had for a number of years. It just hasn't been updated clearly in living memory. So it is being brought forward. It's really just sort of a tweaking of the policy we already have. We generally operate a slightly light touch approach to enforcement. We want to engage with people that are sort of pre-penalties. We engage with residents and businesses. So really, there's not a huge amount to be excited by it. It is generally, it's been written by officers, and it's really about good practice rather than any sort of.
I think it's quite a good example, though, of where something, and you didn't know about it, but officers should have perhaps brought it to our attention early. And Tom, I'm not sure now you know what it is, whether it's something you wanted to add into to your scrutiny.
I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, go on, think about it, perhaps ask officers.
Does it provide a means whereby in some areas of enforcement there are several different bits of legislation that touch on a particular episode, and that if officers talk to each other, they can use a combination of those powers rather than just operating under separate ones? Does it address that holistic approach?
It's more to do with making sure that the enforcement action we take is sort of compliant with law. So obviously there's an element of making sure that we're not issuing fines without sort of due process. It's less around the sort of methodology and more around the sort of legal practice, legal process, which is why it's somewhat less exciting than the title leads you to believe.
Brilliant, thank you. Children's and Young People's Plan, were we going to ask Warren about that?
Well, it's got to bring to the next committee meeting.
So Warren's got that, so that needs to be updated. The annual complaints report, it says elsewhere, just omitted to say here, is coming to the OSC. Similarly, the digital strategy is coming to the OSC.
Facilities management. Under facilities management, there are some facilities management work that deals with statutory issues and non-statutory. So it's general maintenance, facilities management, and then there are things like lifts, boilers, certificates, etc. Do we have a regular reporting of the statutory ones? One of the things I found when I had you guys' job was that we did an independent audit and found that the statutory compliance was not the way the contractor had reported it.
I'm happy to take that away and get that to you.
Yeah, I mean, it comes under the sort of KPI wish list, but I mean, it's important to have a KPI on general facilities management. It's absolutely important to have it on the statutory compliance issues. So if you could answer both those parts separately, that'd be great.
The next one that I thought was possibly of interest was the page 209 hard and soft facilities management services, and whether to look at that. Now I disentangled it in my head from the one on the previous page, and this is about how we're going to procure hard and soft facilities management, and possibly that's one that ought to come to the OSC ought to have a look at.
Great. And maybe the question I've just asked to be fed into that report.
So 210 to 11. 212 has that. So 15 Holland Park Gardens has that very sinister and due course. Did you ask about
I
that?
did, and it's no longer going ahead.
Okay,
So it'll be coming up forward now.
excellent. 13, 14. And then I thought, 250, if we can be able to, given the budget pressure and all the rest of it, I thought maybe, well, when we have an ASC chair or housing, I thought somebody ought to have a look at that.
We can flag it to the vice chair who acts when there is no chair.
Very sorry, one on 214, home
Yep.
care services. Do we, in that, would it address the issue of what's being provided by the NHS and what's being provided by us and how
I think this is just an extension to the current
to the current contract?
contract.
But there's a degree, because of the reorganisation and the integrated care system in the NHS, there's some uncertainties around.
That key decision is probably not the top way to place
Maybe
thinking
not,
about it. I'd have thought in committee that
It's
they
really,
want to look at that in general.
yeah, I
the
mean,
committee-
it was really a question of asking whether the key decision actually took account of current realities change.
it's in due course, so I'm not sure that it's.
And the committee did quite a lot of scrutiny of home care services last year
Right.
in the last council. Sorry, they did look at that as a topic.
Well, should we just flag that one up to the
Whether it
AOC chair as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
When she wants to check it's got all the right ingredients.
Whether it's been updated because of the current changes in
So 216, 17, 18, 19, 20. 21, the Nottingdale Heat Network. It's a really big project. So I wondered if we ought to housing, ought to look at that. What do you think? It's a really big, potentially very, very expensive project.
I think we should, yeah,
Okay,
Right.
so
we should,
I'm not going to disagree with that.
yeah, I think we should add to Conway.
thank you. And then, well, I think up to 223. Any other comments?
No, well, 222, I don't know what
Yep.
Francine thinks, but there's a new one appeared on housing management pets policy, and I just think that's the sort of thing residents will be interested in, is potentially controversial. So it's not an expensive one in the way that, like the heat network, but it could be contentious, and therefore I think
I'm sure it'll raise far more
deserve,
interest.
it would, yes, exactly. So it deserves an area, but Francine, would you agree with that?
I think 223, last point, the contract for the construction for the new homes program, community spaces program, I think is something we have to look into that as well. Because
Yes.
community space is quite important.
I don't know whether we can ask us to give us an answer to a simple question, which is that does the Bramley House window replacement make works? Is the windows being replaced? It doesn't say to what standard. It should be according to council policy, I understand it. So if you're,
Should we just ask that separately?
What standard?
yeah, are they going to be compliant with
I
2030?
wouldn't
50?
expect anyone here to know that. Good.
Can I just
Would you? I think it's a housing thing. Sorry.
Can I just make an important point you've mentioned earlier in terms of members working with the select committee members and the chairs to make sure that important key decisions are made, not made just before scrutiny meetings. And in fact, we've been talking about this for the last 2 years, but over the summer, I have to send someone emails to make sure that an important housing issue can be fed. It was supposed to be the 28th of this month. And then the meeting for the Housing and Communities Select Committee meeting will be the 10th of October. So I'm glad to say that now that has been back. It's really worth to think about it in advance, rather than giving her time to the officers and making sure that everyone emails each other.
I agree. I think it's very seldom any deliberate. It is just it's very hard for officers to think, oh, well, when immediately they think of something they're going to do, to say, well, I must tell OC, but we just have to try and find new and different ways of hammering that lesson home to both the members and officers.
If it's going for 2 years, I think it's about time for people to get used to it.
And we need to pay very close attention to this list ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to play our part and pick up the things that we think we ought to scrutinise. But yes, we can't do that unless we've actually got the information. Obviously, right. Okay, can we move on to page 88, please, on the scrutiny work programme? We're asked to make any comments. I mean, one of the decisions we could and possibly should make tonight is whether we're going to use the 15th of March OSC for the community safety event. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea, unless you've got any other plans for that meeting.
No, I think it's a good idea as well because it also gives it a certain centrality. We'll all be here and something that's really matters to residents. So
It matters to residents, matters to part of our strategy as a committee as well, so it ticks 2 boxes.
has anyone got any other comments on the work plan otherwise?
Yes, just a suggestion. I don't think it's in here. Is the wardens, the warden provision that we have. I think now would be, or over the next few months, would be a good time to review that.
So you'd like to add that to your work plan?
Yeah.
I think that's a very good idea because I think it's the jury's out on whether affordability and effectiveness both need a really good look at, and that had been in place for a bit longer. It's worth actually having a look at it.
And also
That's really good.
the proposal to have a warden per ward as a model.
Yeah.
I think perhaps ought to be aired
It's
as well.
realistic, yeah. Good. Any other issues? Any other, hang on, what I'll say at the end, are there any other urgent matters? Anyone? No? Just remains me to say good night, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To end the recording.